Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bassam Haddad. I am the host of today's Teach In. This is the 18th installment of the Gaza and Context collaborative Teach In series with the formidable Sherene Seikaly, whom I'll introduce in just a minute. We have had, as indicated, a number of teach ins in which we addressed various aspects of the war in Gaza. This one, and if you are geared specifically for the classroom, in terms of potentially assignable material, which will be curated and divided up in segments so that we give educators and anyone interested in learning more systematically about what is going on to actually consult our website and pick and choose what they deem fit. The website is on top of the screen, palestineincontext.org. We thank all of our contributors who have been hard at work for the past 3 months. We are also extremely grateful to the people working behind the scenes. In fact, most grateful for the people working behind the scenes and making all of this possible. So thank you very much to those folks. Too many to mention, but they are listed, and there was actually an interview and discussion with them, and we will also post that so we can see what's been happening behind the scenes. I would like to introduce today's speaker, who is a very dear friend of mine, and this is perhaps the understatement of the new century. Sherene is one of my best friends whom I've known for 26 years and worked with for 26 years and learned so much from and continue to learn from. So I am very thrilled and honored to actually be here with her. So many of you have actually also indicated that they are looking forward to this discussion. So I'll try to close my intro and introduce Sherene's. Well, I'm going to have to address her bio. Sherene, first of all, before we go to the bio, I would like to ask you, how are you? Kifik?
I'm happy to be with you and, like all of us, in deep grief, but also gratitude for everything that we are creating in the midst of this genocide.
Hello, Sherene. Hello. Um, Sherene Sayali is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her book, Men of Capital, Scarcity and Economy in Mandate Palestine, out of Stanford University Press in 2016, explores economy, territory, the home, and the body. Her forthcoming book, From Baltimore to Beirut, on the question of Palestine, or From Baltimore to Beirut, on the question of Palestine, really bad intonation, apologies, tells a global history of capital, slavery, and dispossession. She is the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at UCSB, co-editor of the Stanford Studies Middle Eastern and Islamic Societies and Cultures series, co-editor of Journal of Palestine Studies, and co-editor of Jadaliya. Sherene is, like, frankly, everyone that we have invited is much more than her bio indicates. She has been truly a force, a formidable force in various ways in the classroom and beyond, but certainly in terms of teaching us how to teach, how to write. I still learn from Sherene how to write properly. We have now had these 17 teachings. This 18th one is on Palestine, Zionism, and the Nakba. This particular teach-in is primed for a robust understanding of history of the question of Palestine. It starts with a timeline and guiding analytical principles. Then Shireen will trace the history of anti-Semitism, the rise of Zionism, and the social and economic landscape of Ottoman Palestine. Turning to the 20th century, Shireen will cover British colonial rule and end in 1948 with the troubled twin birth of the Israeli state and the Palestinian refugee condition. As all of you know, we are now at a Palestinian death toll of 25,000 from the battery of Israeli arsenal of bombardment and its consequences. Um, so today we will actually go back to a previous era or eras to address how things developed. So I'll leave the floor to Shereen Those of you who would like to ask questions, specifically on YouTube, towards the end, if you put them on right now, we won't see them. Please start with the word question, and if we have time, we will actually address your questions. Again, welcome, Sherene, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bassam, and thank you for everything that you've been doing to ground us week after week. I'm going to basically give you all a introductory lecture on what happened in 1948. Is my screen shared, or should I do that now?
Go ahead, share it.
Okay. Okay. So, in asking this question, I'm going to go through some guiding principles, claims to some, I'll be going over sort of claims to the land, a brief glimpse of anti Semitism, a brief glimpse of the rise of Zionism, a few kind of background understandings of the Ottoman Palestine, the British Mandate, and then ending with 1948. So basically, our time today will begin roughly in 500 and end in 1948. But don't worry, I'm not going to spend too much time on the earlier period. So let me start with some guiding principles that are really important for teaching the history of Palestine and for teaching what happened in 1948. I think the most important guiding principle of our work together is to reject racism in all forms. And this includes anti-Palestinian hatred, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, Orientalism, anti-Blackness, as we read and think about the history of Palestine. And this is something that is really crucial to not just relaying this history, but also the movement work that it comes out of. The second principle is to decenter conflict. Conflict really can't capture the experiences, the narratives, and the expressions of Palestinians and Israelis over the last 100 years. Too often, this history is really framed, categorized, boxed into notions of conflict, which really doesn't capture those complexities. The third principle is to really situate Palestine in its global context. The history of Palestine is part of the histories of the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, the Arab world, the history of Jewish people, race, colonialism, third worldism, the struggle for decolonization, the rise of US hegemony. It's part of all of those broader histories. And it can also teach us about the promises and limits of the Enlightenment, the exclusionary power of European nationalism, the trajectory of anti Semitism as well, and how it gave birth to the political movement of Zionism. In this way, I think starting out, one of the things that we can do when we place Palestine in its global context is to think about how this history embodies the history of the modern state. So the whole story, in many ways, brings together two kinds of victims of European political modernity: the internal victims of state building, that is, European Jewish people, and the external victims of imperial expansion. And within that, I would think about Palestinian people, as well as Mizrahim, or Arab and Eastern Jews. The the third guiding principle is to insist on radical empathy. The history of genocide of the Jewish people in Europe, known as the Holocaust or the Shoah, which means catastrophe in Hebrew, and the history of the dispossession of the Palestinians in 1948, the Nakba, meaning catastrophe in Arabic, a Nakba that is ongoing to the moment that we are in today, which is a genocide. These two histories of the Nakba and the Shoah are often posed as oppositional, but they are not oppositional. We have to look at them together. This is not to say that the Shoah and the Nakba are similar or comparable. Saying that would be shallow and ahistorical. It is to say that engaging the Shoah and the Nakba together reveals the centrality of catastrophe in both Jewish and Palestinian histories. In this last sentence, I've used Jewish and not Israeli, and this brings me to a final principle, which is that language is a product of history. The terms we use to understand Palestine are objects we have to dismantle on two levels. I want to make here 2 points. One is that we're often accustomed to hearing this kind of two sides narrative in the mainstream media. The problem with this narrative is that it equates the Israeli state with the Palestinian people. Such an equation elides the power differential between a state and the people that it colonizes and occupies. The second thing that it does, this two sides narrative, is that it flattens both Palestinians and Israelis into relatively homogenous categories. It doesn't allow us to think about internal divisions and differences of class, race, gender, sexuality, and ability. The second set of points around this is that often within language, we are accustomed to a binary understanding of history. And we see this through different kinds of pairings that appear either synonymous or antonymous, but aren't. So let's look, for example, at the pairing Jewish and Zionist. Jewish and Zionist, as we all know, are not synonymous. Judaism is the world's first Abrahamic monotheistic religion. It is 4,000 years old. Zionism is a political nationalist movement that began in the late 19th century. Not all Jewish people are Zionists, and not all Zionists are Jewish. I know this might feel super basic, but when these kinds of elisions are everywhere around us and used to silence even the narration of Palestinian history, we have to insist time and again about breaking down these binaries. Another binary is Arab and Jew, which are often posed as opposites, as antonyms. But this is also not the case. In fact, the majority of Jewish people lived under Arab and Muslim rule until the 12th century, when many began migrating to Europe. Until the 1950s, substantial numbers of Arab Jews lived throughout the Arab world, from North Africa to Iraq. And here I should also mention Iranian Jews and Turkish Jews, right? So this is a broad and long history. And it's both Zionism and Arab nationalism that made the category of the Arab Jew impossible. It's important here to understand that Arab and Jewish became national political markers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The seemingly oppositional relationship between Arab and Jew did not cause the Zionist-Palestinian conflict. The Zionist-Palestinian conflict produced this opposition. So let me go before I go there. Let me just talk a little bit about Zionism here, to remind folks that Zionism is a national movement, a nationalist movement. It originally sought to provide refuge for Jewish people from centuries of European persecution, extermination, and ultimately genocide. And it was born of the European Enlightenment, which itself was based on understandings of Europe as superior and civilizing. So we'll talk more about the ways that Zionism both sought a refuge from the European Enlightenment and continued to understand itself as an extension of that European Enlightenment. Like most nationalist movements, Zionists have create claims and links that are spanning historical time, that insist on origin narratives, that we are familiar with in most of these kinds of nationalist movements. So Zionists claim a direct link to Abraham, who immigrated to Palestine from Ur, or Mesopotamia, in the second millennium before the Common Era. In 1000 before the Common Era, King David led the Jewish people to victory over the Canaanites and established the Kingdom of Israel. This kingdom existed as a unified entity for 70 years. The northern kingdom was called Israel and lasted until 722 before the Common Era, when Assyrians conquered it. The southern kingdom was called Judah, and it lasted until 586 before the Common Era, when it fell to the Babylonians. Judeans returned to the land of Israel, as it was called, in 535 before the Common Era, and remained there until the Roman conquests destroyed the Second Temple in 70 Common Era. Eretz Yisrael, or the land of Israel, is a central symbolic site in Jewish faith and practice. We should be clear here: the biblical land of Israel is different from the 20th century state of Israel. So, what are Palestinian claims? Palestinians have lived on the land of Palestine for at least 700 years. They claim to be the descendants of Canaanites, the people who Abraham encountered in the second millennium before the Common Era. Palestine first appears in the work of the Greek historian Herodotus to denote both the space, the coastal land between Phoenicia and Egypt, and an ethnic group, that is, people distinct from both Phoenicians and Egyptians. The Romans adopted the term in the second century Common Era, and Arab geographers have used it since the 7th century Common Era. Zionism and Palestinian nationalism are not unique in this territorialized concept of political identity that has claiming existence since the ancient period. So let's talk briefly about anti-Semitism. What I'll go through here is the three different shifts and their centrality to Jewish history, Palestine, and Israel, and the modern experience. Religious Judeophobia begins with the rise of monotheism. It shifts to social Judeophobia in the 18th century in Europe, and it becomes anti-Semitism with the centrality of race in the 1800s. So what was religious Judeophobia? Religious Judeophobia began in the ancient period with the rise of Judaism. It grew with the institutional dominance of the Catholic Church in the 1400s in Europe. And this often entailed the mass violence and scapegoating of Jewish people, with charges of deicide, blood libel, trials, persecution, and expulsion becoming quite common. Now let's move to social Judeophobia or discrimination. By the 1700s, a majority of Jewish people lived in Christian Europe. In German and Italian cities, Jewish people lived in involuntarily walled neighborhoods called ghettos until about the 1730s. In these ghettos, Jewish people had autonomy over religious, judicial, and social institutions. Then we begin to witness the rise of the Enlightenment in Western and Central Europe. And here we see figures like Kant, Descartes, Newton, and Locke scrutinizing society and culture on rationalist and empiricist premises. In this context, the notion of progress relied on hierarchical understandings of humanity, and this is deeply linked to the histories of imperialism and Orientalism in the Middle East, in the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, as well as the history of colonization and enslavement more broadly throughout the colonial and colonized world. In Europe, the Jew was the internal Oriental. Thinkers like Voltaire understood Jewish people as equal in theory, but not in practice. In Enlightenment logic, Jewish people needed transformation to become moral agents useful to the state. At the same time, there was a legal process of granting Jewish people equal rights known as the Emancipation. This began in Western and Central Europe and in uneven ways. So here, Jewish people gained European citizenship and civil liberties. It was in the United States that Jewish people first became full citizens in 1776. France came in second in this pattern with granting citizenship to Jewish people during the French Revolution. And the promise here was that Jewish people could take part in European social and political life, but the limit of this promise was that people expected Jewish people to integrate, but leave their religious and ethnic identities in the private sphere. As the Jewish reformer Judah Lieb Gordon would put it, quote, "Be a man in the streets and a Jew at home," end of quote. This trade-off would not end well. Europeans began subjecting Jewish people to social discrimination. And in the medieval period, Europeans often uh, 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 expressed hatred for Jewish people for being separate from political life. Whereas in the modern period, people, leaders, and institutions would charge Jewish people for being invisible. So here there's a paradox between the visibility and the invisibility that we can pay attention to. In periods of social and economic duress, states and elites, as we often know, target the most vulnerable as sources of blame. We know this pattern really well from our own contemporary moment. So the promise of the Enlightenment and the Emancipation was Janus-faced. And in some, it only really held true for a quarter of European Jews. The majority lived in Russia, which had, by the 1800s, conquered most of Poland. And life in Tsarist Russia meant no civic equality and poverty for most people, especially Jewish people. In 1791, Catherine the Great established the Pale of Settlement, today, which includes today's Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, Moldova, Ukraine, and parts of Western Russia. The empire's Jewish people were confined to the Pale and subject to 25 years of conscription and extreme poverty. They also would become targets of state-sanctioned attacks known as pogroms, which included murder, rape, and looting. And this is a map of the Pale of Settlement. Let's turn now to the 19th century. Okay, so what I think is really important to remember here in the 19th century is that most people globally in the Middle East, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in North Africa, in China, in Mexico, and many places around the world responded to the challenges of industrialization, nationalism, and global economic depression by turning to constitutionalism, which was a movement that was really, really salient in the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. In Europe, however, mass movements were a little bit different, and we saw these as consolidating as anarchism, communism, as well as anti-Semitism. So during World War I, with the elimination of aristocratic politics and the institutional hegemony of the Catholic Church, basically you begin to see this demise of an old order, which forged and created an alliance between old elites and new nationalist militant reactionaries. So here what you see is an old order joining forces with a new right to embrace a politics of hate. This politics of hate represented Jewish people as standing outside history. They represented them as the source of both capitalism and communism, as the motive force of economy and its downfall, as the explanation of the modern era's many ills. So, what did this mean for Jewish people? This politics of hate resulted in anti Jewish riots in France, pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, and an ominous rise of anti Semitic political parties that embraced imperialism, militarism, and chauvinism. From the 1800s to the 1900s, thinkers began to posit this idea that behavioral and psychological traits are innate and unchangeable. We know this idea as race. The category of race transformed anti Semitism into a modern political phenomenon. So Zionism is a reaction to anti-Semitism in the 1900s. It is neither the only nor the most popular reaction, however. Other reactions included socialism, communism, and immigration. Zionism did not become the popular option for Jewish people fleeing persecution until the rise of Nazi power in Germany in 1933. At that point, countries like the United States and the United Kingdom closed their doors to Jewish refugees, and Palestine began witnessing an upsurge of Jewish immigration. It was at this point that the Zionist movement became the preeminent solution to the Jewish question. One important figure in the rise of Zionism was the Viennese journalist Theodor Herzl. In his book, The Jewish State, Theodor Herzl argued that the Jewish question in Europe was neither social nor religious. He said it was national and political. The solution he proposed was a Jewish state in Palestine that would be an extension of Europe and, quote, a rampart of civilization in a sea of barbarism, end of quote. It's useful to contrast Herzl's thinking with another Zionist thinker named Asher Ginsburg, or as he was known, Ahad Ha'am. Ha'am came from a Hasidic family in the Pale of Settlement. In his article, The Truth from Eretz Yisrael, he drew on his 1896 visit to Palestine to posit a cultural vision of Zionism. He hoped for an intellectual center that did not have political or military importance. So here, at the end of the day, both of these men are invested in the Zionist project, but in different ways. So I just want to relay some of those differences. So Herzl understood the land of Palestine as empty of a unified people, whereas Ha'am predicted that the natives of Palestine would not yield their land. Whereas Herzl insisted that Palestine was an uncultivated desert, Ha'am reported that it was hard to find land that was not already tilled. Whereas Herzl was concerned with what was good for Jewish people, Ha'am cared much more for what was good for Judaism. Ha'am deeply mistrusted Europe, and whereas Herzl was invested in Europe as a civilizational force, it would be Herzl's approach that triumphed, and Zionism would emerge in response to European hierarchies of humanity. But instead of dismantling that hierarchy, it recreated it. This is where we see the mantra that the land of Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. So early Zionists would take part in this mantra, which would have a very long life. And I think it's really important to understand here, what did people mean in the late 19th century when they said this? Zionists didn't imagine that there were no people on the land of Palestine, but rather that they were not a people. So here we see the very beginning formations of the denial of peoplehood, Palestinian peoplehood, that we continue to confront till this very day. So Herzl would describe a set of stereotypes, caricatures. He would look at the wealthy effendis or elites that he said could be had for a price. He would look at he would characterize the remaining impoverished peasants as being easily removed without incident. He described the Palestinian people as a motley crew without anything defining or unifying them. He said they stood outside of history. So here we say and see the very terms that people like Herzl and Zionism more broadly were escaping, and the way that they recreated them when they arrived to Palestine. So, what is happening in Ottoman Palestine in this period? 18th century Palestinian merchants and peasants in this period are setting the stage for transformation through political centralization, the commodification of land, the urban domination of the countryside, and the transformation of a notable elite into an embryonic class. For people who are familiar with this history, I am basically here mostly drawing on the canonical book Rediscovering Palestine by Pshara Domani. That book teaches us that the commercial land market in Palestine was well underway before Zionist immigration. So here, the important lesson to keep in mind is, and this is a lesson that Domani draws on from Janet Abou-Lughod's Before European Hegemony and many other studies that explain to us how we can see capitalist transformation taking place in other parts of the world through the commercialization of agriculture, as opposed to only locating it on the factory floor in industrialization. So if we were to follow that history, we would see that Palestinians were and continue to be a heterogeneous group comprised of different locales, classes, and interests. Here, what's really important to understand is that Palestinian farmers, urban elites, various different kinds of people are using and adapting Ottoman citizenship to demand political and economic rights. Palestinian merchants, farmers, everyday people were subjects, not objects of history. Here's an Ottoman map of Palestine. Let me now turn quickly to the British Mandate. World War I inaugurated British rule in Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, and French rule in Syria and Lebanon. The British Mandate for Palestine basically made its commitment to Zionism very clear from the outset. And the way that it did that was through the Balfour Declaration of November 1917, which inaugurated the British commitment to a quote, a national home for the Jewish people, with the qualification that this would not prejudice the quote, civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. It was at this moment that Jewish becomes an ethno-national category in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration basically is defining the land and its inhabitants by this category, despite the fact that Jewish people were at this point in history constituting 5 to 6% of the people who lived in Palestine. What this declaration does is it decrees the majority of the Palestinians who live on the land nameless. They become defined by what they are not. They are called non-Jewish. Two parallel processes began to take root as a result of this declaration. First, the partitioning of people into categories of Jewish and non Jewish, deserving and undeserving of a national home. Second, the erasure of the Palestinian, who appeared only as a non Jewish inhabitant, bearing religious and civil but not political rights. The British mandate in Palestine envisioned a future for the land, but not for its people. From the League of Nations perspective, these Palestinians kept the country in a state of stagnation. The land needed, and this is the League of Nations language, a quote, able and energetic people to facilitate its modern arrival. Given the British mandate's commitment to the Jewish national home policy, the Palestinians could never be subjects trained to, quote unquote, stand on their feet like the people in Iraq or Transjordan. So, British officials' policy basically sought to simply maintain the status quo for Palestinian Muslims and Christians. Don't develop, don't invest, don't fund. British rule was so parsimonious that it was only when World War II induced new capital flows which facilitated Palestinians' escape from indebtedness that many villagers paved roads and built schools. Let's look briefly at 20th century Palestine. 20th century Palestine was a period of intense social, economic, and political change. It was a period where we witnessed labor organizing, a women's movement, a pan-Arabist political party called the Istiqlal, a nascent capitalist class, and unprecedented youth organizing. The Young Turk Revolt of 1908 and its promises of liberty, equality, and fraternity resonated in Palestine. At the same time, there were growing gaps between elites and the subaltern majority in the interwar era, or what we could call the liberal age. In Palestine, where the ascending middle classes, as well as traditional elite Jerusalemite families such as the Husseinis and Nashashibis, positioned the Palestinian subaltern as authentic but ignorant raw material in need of moral, social, and intellectual reform to serve the nation. And this positioning of the subaltern, so here we mean the farmers, the workers, the villagers, the Bedouin, everybody who aren't the elite, right? What we see throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa, throughout the history of the modern Middle East, is the way that these subalterns are both the raw material of the nation, but meant to be contained and silenced. But of course, as we know, subalterns throughout the modern Middle East and North Africa and in Palestine waged a stiff battle against these logics. In Palestine, farmers dispossessed of their lands became rapidly proletarianized, and the Palestinian labor movement was innovative and active. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, subalterns grew increasingly frustrated with elite Palestinians' insistence on diplomacy with British colonial rule. And during the first half of the 1930s, the Youth Congress was the largest national organization in Palestine. It tackled land encroachment and social inequality through social uplift and street demonstrations, and it influenced Palestinian public opinion and set the groundwork for broader rebellion. So the people to read about this period of rebellion from the 1920s throughout the 1930s are Rana Barakat, Charles Anderson, Ted Swedenborg, and many others. By 1935, the radical militant and Islamist Azzeddin al-Qassam brought his populist message from the Great Syrian Revolt of 1925 to Palestine. He began organizing dispossessed farmers and laborers and called for armed insurgents against British colonialism, Zionist settlement, and Palestinian elite politics. This brings us to the Palestinian rebellion, and here I just want to insist that there are multiple moments of rebellion and uprising throughout the 19th and 20th centuries in Palestine that I'm totally moving over quickly here. By 1936, Palestinians mobilized a broad-ranging national uprising against both British colonialism and Zionist settlement. They organized a national strike for 3 months. Um, they organized a national strike for 6 months. And this is something I always, when I teach this, I always ask people to imagine what it might be like to organize a national strike for 6 months without the kinds of technologies that we are used to today. The rebellion, the Great Revolt, turned into a 3-year armed uprising against British colonial rule, which came to be called the Great Revolt. It was the most sustained anti-colonial rebellion in the Arab interwar world. And it wasn't just a paramilitary affair. There was a network of national and popular committees that built rebel institutions, which included intelligence, taxation, and juridical branches. The revolt was more than a call for political independence. It was also a struggle for social justice against elite politics. So here, what I want to gesture to is the ways that often in most of the literature about Palestine, people will often say, oh, the Palestinians didn't do state building, which is a really problematic thing to say more generally. But I think it also ignores the multiple kinds of experiments with popular sovereignty and popular state building that we see in the 1920s and the 1930s. It was in the revolt that the British colonial government innovated techniques of deportation, torture, targeted assassination, and collective punishment that continue to mark the Palestinian experience. In the meantime, Zionists were hard at work shaping a cohesive settlement community around this new ethno national understanding of what it meant to be Jewish in Palestine. The promise was that they could finally become European, but only by leaving Europe. The Zionists had established by the 1920s a parastatal infrastructure that would become the foundation of the future Israeli state. This included the governing body of the Jewish Agency, the Jewish National Fund, which Zionists had established in 1901 to purchase land, the labor organization or the Histadrut, which organized Jewish laborers during the mandate, the military organization of the Haganah, and the Vad Le'omi, a Jewish People's Council, which would become the Israeli Parliament or Knesset in 1948. The British colonial administration bolstered the legitimacy of each of these institutions at every turn. Now let's look at waves of European Jewish immigration to Palestine. Zionist immigration to Palestine came in 5 ways, each with its own distinctive ideologies and conditions. I won't give you the details of each of these waves now, but let me tell you about the first 2. The first wave, from 1882 to 1903, was known as the Lovers of Zion and modeled its policy on French settlement in Algeria, large monocrop plantations, and native labor. By 1900, about 65% of these settlers had left Palestine, but this wave of immigration doubled European Jewish numbers in Palestine. Labor Zionism led the second wave and instituted the conquest of land and labor, which hired only Jewish labor on cooperative farms or kibbutzim. Labor Zionism was invested in nationalism and socialism and espoused physical labor, self sacrifice, settlement on the land, and redemption from the passive figure of ghetto acquiescence. Labor Zionists wanted to revive an authentic, national, muscular self. They called this ideal the new Jew. So here we see the jumps in population and the changes between 1878 to 1936. Note how between 1914 to 1922, the European Jewish population went from 8 to 11% of Palestine more generally. The big jump happens in 1933, as I mentioned earlier, with the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany. Let's turn a little bit to the Nazi rise to power. In Germany, nationalism, imperialism, and anti-Semitism merged in the interwar period. An extreme right wing of middle class people spread throughout Germany, Italy, and Austria in the early 20th century. By the 1920s, nationalist right wing forces in Germany fostered power by breeding on economic discontent and fear of socialism and communism. There was much rhetoric about fighting against the quote unquote invisible foes of the German people. By 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power through populist appeals and a politics of hate that posed Jews and communists as internal enemies. The Nazi Party brought about a rapid shift from parliamentary democracy to totalitarian fascism, wedding war, racism, and aggressive nationalism. The Nazi Party was premised on the idea of Aryan racial supremacy. Its aim was to assume authority over who could live and who could die. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws deprived Jewish people of citizenship, outlawed intermarriage between Jewish people and non Jewish people, forbade Jewish people from parks, cinemas, and restaurants, and mandated the donning of the Yellow Star of David. By 1938, the quote unquote Aryanization of business meant the destruction of Jewish businesses and forbidding of occupations in academia, law, and multiple other spheres. That year, the Nazi paramilitary organization, the SS, attacked Jewish businesses and homes, beat thousands, and killed hundreds of Jewish people in a pogrom known as Kristallnacht. It was in this period that France, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and the United States closed their doors to refugees. Let's talk about the Holocaust or the Shoah. The Nazi Party experimented with eugenics from the inception of their rise to power. Between 1934 and 1935, the Nazis sterilized 350,000 Germans that they labeled as quote unquote alcoholics, gay people, schizophrenics, and the quote unquote work shy. By 1939, the Nazis had killed 70,000 people with mental and physical disabilities through lethal injection. Civilian populations had become strategic targets. On 30 January 1939, Hitler announced the so called final solution, his plan for the extermination of all Jewish people. By January 1941, the Nazis had killed 1 million Jewish people. By 1942, people began to learn of the massive scale of the Nazi genocide of 6 million Jews and an additional 5 to 9 million Roma, communists, socialists, Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, ethnic Poles, Soviets, people with disabilities, and people charged with quote unquote homosexuality and sexual dissonance. Through mobile vans, concentration camps, gas chambers, and medical murder, the Nazis created an assembly line of death. 72% of Europe's Jewish population had perished. British forces in the Middle East paid a heavy price in their battle against the Nazis during World War II. Exhausted by a war that had turned Britain from the largest creditor nation to the one most in debt, and facing the rapid attenuation of its empire, Britain decided that the sun had set on their Palestine project. On November 29, 1947, the General Assembly of the newly established United Nations voted to terminate the British mandate and partition Palestine into an Arab and a Jewish state. Between November 1947 and May 1948, the Yishuv and the Palestinians, the European Jewish settlers and the Palestinians, were immersed in a war for the future. David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel on May 14, 1948. The armies of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, and Iraq invaded the next day. Israeli nationalist myths depict the 1948 war as a miraculous victory of the small David against the ugly Arab Goliath. The reality on the ground was far from that. As Israeli historians Avi Shlaim, Benny Morris, and Ilan Pape, along with Palestinian, Middle Eastern, and Western scholars such as Walid Khalidi, Noor Masalha, and Maxine Rodison, have evidenced, the Zionists were better prepared, mobilized, organized, and centralized than the Arab armies. And by the second stage of the war, the Zionists were also better armed. Rather than an impenetrable wall of hatred and animosity that was typically depicted, the Zionists had an intimate ally across the Jordan River. King Abdullah of Transjordan and the Jewish Agency enjoyed a 30-year strategic partnership. Moreover, while the Arab armies used rhetoric of trying to salvage Palestine, they really cared less about the Palestinians and were mostly preoccupied with their own national interests to coordinate militarily or diplomatically. The Nakba took place. The Nakba took place in what historians today categorize as 4 stages. Just the first, from December 1947 to March 1948, was a period of attack and counterattack between Zionist and Palestinian forces. In this period, the Haganah shelled Arab neighborhoods and villages and authorized the destruction and expulsion of the villages of Arab Suqair and Qisaria south of Haifa in February of 1948. 2 militias that had broken away from the Haganah, the Irgun, or the National Military Organization, and the Lehi, targeted armed combatants and civilians at bus stops, shopping centers, and markets. The Haganah's military advances and psychological warfare marked this period as one of panic and fear. During these 4 months, Palestinians with means fled in the hopes of return. The second phase lasted from April 1948 to June 1948. Sorry about that error. Let's fix that live. Okay. And here what's important to note is that beginning in March 1948, we begin to see the Zionist forces, the Haganah, launching a shift to a large-scale, highly organized and sustained set of operations. And this was known as Plan Dalet or Plan D, which was signed and dispatched to the Haganah in March 1948. This is really marking this next phase. And we've learned about Plan Dalet from Walid Khalidi as well as Benny Morris. And what we have to understand is that basically by the end of this period, it was clear that there was a dramatic conceptual change and that this was a full-fledged war of conquest. During this phase between April, sorry, one second. Just one second, almost there. During this phase between April and June 1948, fighting was mostly concentrated in the Jerusalem-Jaffa corridor. And on April 9, 1948, Irgun and Lehi forces, numbering about 120 troopers, advanced on a village near Jerusalem called Deir Yassin, engaging in fire with Palestinian forces in the village. These troopers pillaged the village, shot fleeing civilians, and killed 100 to 120 villagers. While the Jewish Agency and the Haganah Command would condemn the massacre, Deir Yassin sparked fear throughout Palestine and anger throughout the Arab world. Later that month, the Haganah stunned and overpowered Palestinian forces and Arab forces in Haifa. The city fell in 2 days. By May of 1948, and after the invasion of the Arab armies, expulsion of villages had become regular practice. At this point, the Haganah became the core of the Israeli army, and by the end of June, 250,000 Palestinians had fled or been expelled under the force of fire. The third phase of the Nakba was between July and October 1948. That July, Israeli forces forcibly expelled 60,000 Palestinian men, women, children, and the elderly from the towns of Lidda and Ramla, southeast of Jaffa and Tel Aviv. And here I want to quote Benny Morris. Quote, from Lidda, the inhabitants left on foot, some being stripped of money and jewelry by Israeli troops at checkpoints on the way out. From Ramla, the population was trucked to a point near the village of El Qubab, from which they proceeded eastward on foot. An Israeli trooper later described the traces of the refugee columns. To begin with, utensils and furniture, and in the end, bodies of men, women, and children scattered along the way. The fourth phase of the Nakba of 1948 occurred from October 1948 to March 1949. This was when Israeli forces conquered the Nakab, the Jerusalem corridor, and the Upper Galilee. At this stage, commanders were clearly bent on driving out the people in the area that they were conquering. In December 1948, Israel issued the emergency regulations on the properties of absentees. An absentee was any person who owned property in Israel and who on or after November 29, 1947, the date of the UN partition plan, had gone outside Israel. This legislation was so broad that it included technically everyone, but it was the Palestinians who were now absentees. Later embodied in law, this emergency legislation facilitated the expropriation of the land and property of Palestinian refugees. This is where we begin to see the category of the present absentee, which would become a central category of experience, law, literature, and culture. The al-hadir al-ghayib, present on the land, absent in the law. By the end of the Nakba, Israeli forces destroyed 470 to 530 Palestinian villages and emptied Palestinian cities and neighborhoods. Looting, massacres, and imprisonment prevailed. Rape was also reported. As a result of the Nakba, approximately 750,000 Palestinians became stateless refugees. The remaining 150,000 would become second-class citizens living under military rule in Israel. They were now strangers in their own home. For the Palestinians, the exodus and its aftermath were a full-fledged catastrophe. The denial of self-determination and basic rights, as well as the dispossession and displacement, did not end in 1948. As we know, every day in this 109th day of this genocide, these processes continue in the present, continue relentlessly every day. And this is why Palestinians call our condition an ongoing Nakba. Okay, I'm done. Bassam, there you are.
One moment. Thank you very much, Shireen. This has been a just judging by a lot of the comments that we're getting on all platforms. This has been remarkably insightful and so much needed, given the frankly the quality of the discourse one experiences, notably in the mainstream. Um, we do have you know a few questions, but before we go to any questions, can you share with us a bit more about the conflation, given what you have discussed? And I know that we've discussed this before here on Gaza and Context. Can you share a little bit more about the conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
Sure. I think one of the ways to reframe that language is to really talk about the opposition to Zionism as opposed to the racialized process and category and history of anti-Semitism. As we know, Jewish people in the United States and far beyond have been central in this moment and in a very long tradition of anti-Zionism. And I think what is crucial to understand in this deeply, deeply wounded history is the ways in which whether be it the Jewish struggle for liberation or the Black struggle for liberation, or the Indigenous struggle for liberation, communist struggles for liberation, all of these struggles, right? They teach us that no one is free until we are all free. And what I tried to do in this lecture is to really show the ways in which the problem of the European nation state was for the Zionists the solution. And the problem can never be the solution, right? And so here, the reaction, the Zionist kind of consolidation around this idea of a territorial nation state that is exclusionary actually continues the very hierarchies that Zionists were attempting to escape. And so, for our moment today, we have to understand that we cannot align the category of Jewish with the category of Zionist.
Thank you. We're going to a question from YouTube. Um, and the question is, were the dominant ideas behind each wave of migration to Palestine about quote unquote revenge from Europe's anti Semitism, or just trying to start a new life someplace new?
Um, well, I mean, I, in my own practice as a historian, I try not to spend too much time categorizing people's intentions or feelings. So I wouldn't use the language of revenge. I don't think that that's useful. I think that we have to, each of these waves of immigration have their own specific histories and locations. So we have to, look at, I mean, there's language always fails us. So when I say European Jews, I'm also taking part in a great deal of erasure. There are multiple kinds of Europe, right? So the waves of immigration have to be studied closely for their ideological commitments, for their political commitments, for the kinds of politics that they emerge from, right? So I wouldn't really think about it in terms of revenge in that way. I would think about it in terms of concrete interests and commitments arising out of specific conditions.
There are a couple of notes actually that sort of converge with something I'd like to get a bit more from you about, and that is the narrative. And I'm going to just remake some of these notes. The narrative that we sometimes hear is that the state of Israel was announced or created by the partition plan, and then all of a sudden or immediately, uh, several Arab armies attacked Israel. And the actual history is that that's not actually what happened. That's not the sequence. And I know you touched on that. Can you tell us a little bit about that period and the sequence of events?
Well, I mean, I think what's really important about, again, thinking about the broader meta narrative, right, is to really pay much more attention to what is the geopolitical moment in this period. Right. And so one thing that where we often hear, and that we heard even back in that period of time, was okay. Um, this is something the Israelis often say: we never had a partner, we never had a peace partner. And in fact, if you look more closely at both the sequence and the closer history of this, you see that almost every Arab leader was ready to sit down and make negotiations with the then new Israeli state, and the position was always to defer any discussion of potential solutions, because at this moment, what actually winds up happening after 1948, after the fleeing of Palestinians, is a really concerted effort of Palestinians to return to the land, right? And these waves of returnees were even a bigger threat to people like David Ben Gurion. And this is a history that we have to pay very close attention to, that Chair Robinson, I think, does a great job of telling us about in her book, Citizen Strangers. And so I think, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. There are actually questions that are not probably going to be productive for this particular session, in terms of some of the, not even current events, but some of the more recent history. But I would like to move to, and I know we've we've kept you here for longer than an hour, which was supposed to be the limit of the teaching. But I'd like to move to a couple of questions that actually, one of them we have, and one I'd like to ask a pedagogical question. The first is, what would you recommend as one or two books to read on that period that you addressed, if someone is limited to this number of books, or even articles? What would be a couple of texts that you recommend?
I would recommend Rashid Khalidi, of course, his recent 100 Years War on Palestine, and also his book, Palestinian Identity. I would also recommend Noor Masalha's work. I would recommend Avi Schleim has a great kind of summary of all of the debates within Israeli historiography, an article called the debate about 1948. I would also really try to read the primary documents of the time. So I think read everything that Ghassan Kanafani has written and left behind for us to learn from. Arif al-Arif is another person who is really important. I would also read about the ways that Palestinians have narrated and told the story through oral history after 1948. And the person I rely on the most here is Rosemary Sayegh, who really innovated the method of oral history in Palestinian studies and more broadly. There's such a rich set of scholarship and literature on this topic, and much more that I'm kind of would love to share. And I think we have various toolkits and essential reading lists that you can find online, both through Jadalia, but also through places like the Palestinian Feminist Collective.
And I should say in this regard that we are working on such a reading list, which will be published soon on palestiniancontext.org. and it will have a number of options, because this also relates to my final question. Not every educator has sufficient time to go through the history as meticulously as someone who is teaching an entire course on this subject. So that will actually be helpful in that regard. My question is, since this is a pedagogical session, or very much so, how would you recommend uh, educators approach this subject? And I don't actually like to call it a conflict, because it's more of a history of dispossession followed by subjugation. But for the sake of brevity, how do you suggest educators who have limited time, let's say 2 weeks, which would mean 4 or 6 50-minute sessions, or 2 weeks of 3 hours each? How would you suggest, I mean, right off the bat, I didn't prepare you for this, how would you suggest they approach the subject matter in terms of assigning material or lecturing or
Well,
lecturing?
I think the most important thing is to start with the guiding principles that I started with, which I, f- I think those guiding principles are what Palestine gifts us. And also, I think they're really important for teaching more broadly. And so, the first principle, I mean, your question is both about approach and and a kind of how to what to use, what not to use. I mean, I hope that this lecture is a good kind of entry point for people. I would say, just in terms of the preparation for content, there's so much good material that's out there. Really, there's an abundance of great pedagogical tools. Omnia Shakri has a wonderful volume called Understanding the Middle East that's specifically geared to um, teachers in the secondary system and high school. And so I think that's a really useful place for people to start. And I have a piece in that which draws a lot on the lecture that you heard today. Um, so I would say on that level, I think a lot of people get really nervous because they say, I'm not an expert and what do I need to understand? But I think the repetition of that lack of expertise sometimes functions as a way for people that might be too intimidated to read about it. And so the first thing that I would say is just read. Read. There's so many resources out there. This is not larger than you. You can understand this. So that's number one. Number two, I think, are the guiding principles that I started with, was especially for people teaching in you know um Turtle Island in the United States and Northern America and in Western Europe. I think it's really, really, really important to base all of our pedagogical commitment around these guiding principles. Number one, a commitment to anti-racism as foundational to both our pedagogy and our movements for liberation. Number two, what I'm calling here radical empathy. And the reason that I spend a lot of time with the history, um, the history of anti-Semitism, the history of Jewish persecution, is because I think that centering that experience is important for us to understand how racism and dispossession work and how we might envision liberation in the future. The challenge in the classroom is to create a kind of a laboratory that is both brave and safe, right? That where people can really express the things that they're afraid of expressing, but based in what I'm suggesting is radical empathy. And in that regard, I think the key or the invitation is to say, okay, how can I confront, accept, even attempt to understand um, historical claims when they oppose my own? And so I think in doing that kind of, and really moving beyond the ways that we have come to think of suffering in a hierarchy, in a zero sum game, and really trying to say, well, what are the ways that we can experiment in centering suffering and centering other people's suffering while demanding in this very moment an end to the genocide of the Palestinian people, an end to the ongoing Nakba, an immediate ceasefire. I think holding all that complexity isn't just simply a strategy. I think it is the only way forward. And I think when we go into the classroom, we're really embodying that kind of approach, of, again, anti-racism, radical empathy, moving beyond binaries, questioning the logics that we've inherited, the logics of the nation state that really rest on this exclusionary logic, this kind of imperative of making everybody the same.
Thank you very much, Shireen, Professor Seikaly, for this remarkable teaching. We have a lot of problematic comments in the chat, like, that this was brilliant, and all these, we'll try to block these people about this, saying all these things about this teaching and about you. This was really remarkable, Shireen, and I know that we could do another one with you on the post 48 era or periods, but we will stop here. I apologize to some of you for some of the questions that we will not be able to address. It's been almost 90 minutes, and we promised Shireen 60 to 75. Are there any last words, not last words, period, but last words in this teaching that you'd like to share?
I think that people ought to learn this history to really understand how long, when Rashid Khalidi says 100 years of war, we are basically talking about 100 years of the denial of Palestinian political rights and the denial of Palestinian peoplehood. And I think only in rejecting that denial and in calling for an immediate ceasefire and calling for an end to the genocide in Gaza can we all envision a better and freer future.
Thank you very much, Shireen, again, and thanks to everyone who joined. Thanks to all of the collaborators. I always say I'm not gonna use this word, but all the co-sponsors and co-organizers of these teach-ins and events, and to all of the people working behind the scenes. We will be back next week with another teach-in, very similar to this one, also pedagogically oriented, in more explicit ways, even though all the teach-ins are, with Professor Osama Maqdisi, who will be addressing the age of coexistence, or the topic of coexistence. It should be on Monday at 1 p.m., but please follow Jadaliya's Twitter and website, as well as PalestineInContext.org, for these events and for much more that will soon be up on the website, including a curated version of all of our teachings. Uh, this teaching, for instance, we will also be segmenting into different parts so that you can get to the part you like, or you can watch the whole thing. And thanks to people like Shireen, who have been able to give us a lot to think about and a map to follow if we would like to read further and engage further. Have a wonderful day, Shireen, and thank you all for joining us. Shukran كتير.
Ella.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
طيب. Salam.